All right, welcome everyone to Dysfunction Mapping. Ask Me Anything session with Michael Lloyd. So I'm going to actually turn it over to Michael, the creator of Dysfunction Mapping, and we're going to get started.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Jimmy. So, hi everybody. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. Please yell at me or let me know if there's any issue with my audio. Yeah, it's good to see you all. So for those of you that don't know me, yeah, I'm Mike, Agile coach, Scrum Master. I've been helping teams for about 9 years. Main thing that I'm focusing on lately is, of course, dysfunction mapping, which we will talk a little bit about in a sec. But other kind of background that you might care about. So I'm a PSM3 holder. So I'm someone with a kind of maybe over-the-top pedantic knowledge of Scrum. I'm also an SPC6, so I've got a reasonable amount of knowledge of SAFe, and I've done a lot of training in both Scrum and SAFe for a lot of different organizations. But my main focus is on helping practitioners to get better at solving problems. So that's kind of where this tool has come from. And so, yeah, in terms of what we were going to do today, my thinking was we're going to jump into a Miro board. I might actually ask that you start getting into that Miro board now. So I think that link has just gone in because there is a picture in there of a dysfunction map that we can kind of look at just as I give us the high level. But today's basically just Ask Me Anything, right? So you may have already been to one of my classes or another meetup where I've talked about dysfunction mapping in a bit more detail, or maybe you're completely new today to this concept, which is fine as well. But what I'm not going to do is just spend 30 minutes talking to you about what dysfunction mapping is. I'm just going to give a brief high-level overview for those who are completely new, and then we'll throw it over to like a lean coffee style format to just ask whatever questions you are all interested in, and they can be as basic and entry level about what dysfunction mapping is about. They can be high level and you know, based on your experiences. Maybe you've already done a class and you've got some like deep follow-on questions. We'll just see where that takes us. What I would say though is we don't need to keep it constrained to dysfunction mapping. Like I say, I'm an agile practitioner of many years experience. If there's other stuff that you're curious to get my take on, I'd love to answer whatever questions we think would be useful or valuable. So yeah, I guess we'll jump quickly just into like the brief explanation. So hopefully if you're in the Miro board, what you can see is an example of a dysfunction map. This is what one of these looks like once you've started to put it together. And I'll just kind of give a brief overview of what we're doing with it so that you can maybe ask any of those follow-up questions. So main thing is, as you can probably see, it's just a visual tool for organizing your thoughts.
Still have the great thing.
You might just need to keep an eye on muting people as well. If you can just give me a... Oh, thank you. So this is just a way of organizing your thoughts. It's stickies on a whiteboard, right? Which means that it's nothing massively different from things that you probably already do today. But the idea behind dysfunction mapping is to take all of the things that I personally learned over years of helping teams and kind of take all those various techniques and approaches that have helped me and put it into a repeatable structure so that people can more easily create a hypothesis for change. And so the idea here is you actually start on the right-hand side with this thing called symptom. And this is where we capture all of the observable negative outcomes, problems, challenges, pain points that we can see in our teams, that our teams are reporting to us, that the organization and the stakeholders report to us. And this is where it starts from a point of empiricism, right? So we're not trying to just start from theory. We're actually trying to start from, what is it our teams care about? We then connect those through to dysfunctions, which are our missing pieces, our agile practices or approaches that perhaps we're not doing as well as we would like. We're maybe breaking rules of Scrum, for example, and we're hypothesizing a relationship between those things. And we're saying, hey, maybe, for example, the fact that we're not setting a sprint goal could be one of the reasons that we have lots of work rollover and status updates in our daily Scrums, right? That's a hypothesis that we're putting together. Then we spend some time thinking about purpose. Why does that rule or practice exist, right? So why does Scrum say that we should create a sprint goal? This is about making sure that we as practitioners understand these frameworks and these values and principles before we start asking other people to change. And then once we've understood that purpose, we can go into solution, which again is a hypothesis. It's what's something I believe I can do that will potentially take us in the direction of fulfilling that purpose. It'll be a small incremental step to positive change. And then once you've come up with that solution, then you can define a measure, which we actually do by going right back to the beginning. I call it closing the loop and looking at our symptoms and saying, how would I measure if this symptom were to go away? And so that way we can test a hypothesis by actually seeing if those reported issues that our teams cared about in the first place actually do change in a measurable way. And so the idea here is not for these to be perfect first time. The idea is to come up with a way of rapidly hypothesizing so that we can inspect and adapt, test and learn, and hopefully have a positive impact on our teams. So that's a lot of ramble from me. So I guess, like I say, the thing I would love for us to do is to just now take whatever questions you all have about anything I've just said or anything more widely. So what you can see at the top is a topics to discuss, a little whiteboard with a bunch of blank white stickies. So what we'll probably do is just start a bit of a timer and give everyone a chance to just write some stuff down on the stickies. And then we'll maybe have a little voting session to decide which things we think we maybe want to talk about. And I'm noticing that some of those items over there are not locked, so I'm going to lock those as well. So I will start I don't know, should we say 3-minute timer? Is that going to be enough? And then we'll see what questions come up. And just while you're all thinking, I just want to reiterate, no questions off the table. Happy to talk about dysfunction mapping, happy to talk about agile generally, happy to nerd out and talk about Star Wars or death metal if that's your jam. Whatever you guys think could be fun to talk about, I'm happy to go along. So I can just see that Lucy has said that she's maybe having some issues with the Miro board. So if you've got a question and you can't get into the board, feel free to put it in the chat and we'll add it to the board ourselves and give people a chance to vote on it. And then again, it's just a lean coffee format. So there's no real prompt there other than, what would you like to talk about or what would you like to ask? Cool. So that was the 3 minutes. How are we feeling? Is that enough time? Does anyone, obviously we can continue adding stuff. You don't have to stop right now. So feel free to add questions as we go. And anything that we don't answer now, by the way, we'll try to come back to in some form, whether I'll do an email or a LinkedIn post or something to cover the stuff that doesn't get captured. So yeah, I can see there's still some people typing. Should we give it another 30 seconds and then we'll do a vote?
Yeah, so while you're waiting, you might want to read over what some of the other people have on here. So when it's time to vote, you'll be familiar with the stickies. I'll try to kind of group them closer to each other.
All right, so like I say, feel free to keep writing, and we can add more, and anything that doesn't get voted on will we'll find a way to answer that. For the voting, the best way to do that I found is to use llamas, because they are just the the universal best form of voting in my humble opinion. So you will see a herd of llamas off to the left of the board, and this is basically dot voting, right? So anyone's familiar with dot voting, you know what we're about to do. The idea is everyone gets up to 3 llamas that they can put on or near a sticky that they would like to talk about. And you can either put those 3 llamas spread around on 3 different topics, or if there's one thing you really want to talk about, you can put 3 llamas all on one thing. So bear in mind, this is a honor system, so I'm trusting that you'll only vote 3 times, and we'll do a little 1-minute timer so you've got a chance to kind of read through and place your votes. So I'll start that now. 3 llamas, 3 topics. And in fact, while that's voting, I'm going to quickly run to the toilet because I did not think ahead, and I will be back in 30 seconds. You can definitely see some llamas piling up. We got some topics. Well, that's a time up. So hopefully everyone has had a chance to vote. So what I'm going to do now is start dragging over some of the stickies to the right-hand topics box in the order of votes. So correct me if I miss any of the votes, but I believe that the top one is this one here that says, can you give an example of something that was seen as problematic, but discovered it was actually something of a bigger dysfunction? Really good question. We'll get to that in a sec. But I'm just going to quickly move some others over as well. So I can see there's one here about knowledge of the Scrum guide that maybe is next. Then we've maybe got a couple of ties for third place. So put those down here. And then maybe some, oh wait, actually that one is probably meant to be in here. And then we'll come back maybe if we've got time and look through the rest. Cool. So I believe the top voted one was, can you give an example of something that was seen as problematic, but was discovered it was actually a symptom of a bigger dysfunction? So yeah, this is a really good question because, part of the idea here is we don't actually have a perfect understanding of the system, and no amount of analysis can give us a perfect understanding of the system because it's complex, right? There are many unknown unknowns. And so sometimes you can kind of tie things together on a dysfunction map. It can seem like you kind of understand what's going on, and then you start taking action and things maybe don't go the way that you expect. So there's one thing that springs to mind, and then maybe we'll see if something else pops in as we go. But there's actually a example on this board that comes from this is a simplified board that's down at the bottom there, but it's taken from real life examples. And there's one on there about the product owner not attending sprint planning. And that actually came about because I had started with a new team, and they were just really struggling to get things done. They were constantly, unfinished work at the ends of sprint, lots of rollover. And in conversations, what seemed to be happening was that everyone was blaming the product owner and the absence of the product owner from key events. They were having to start work that they didn't understand. There was no clarity on what was being done. And other than talking to the product owner, everyone else's sort of description of what was going on was that the product owner wasn't around when they need to be there. And so I obviously went in probably with a bit of bias, and this is part of why the process has these boundaries. I went with a bit of bias thinking, right, okay, how is it that I can mentor the product owner, teach the product owner, help them to be better at being a product owner. And I was very much accepting that worldview that they just maybe didn't know better, and I had to teach them. But then when I went in and had a conversation with the product owner and tried to kind of remain open and get their worldview, it turned out that actually there was a sort of senior manager in the organization that was constantly expecting the product owner to be in other meetings and other sessions with them. And as soon as I kind of started digging into it, the realization there was, well, actually the product owner didn't feel empowered to make decisions about his own time and to go to the things that he actually wanted to be going to, because he felt that the team lead, the kind of organizational lead, had more sway, more control. And then interestingly, the same thing happened again, because I went and talked to that leader, because now I'd had a few more conversations, and the feeling that I was getting was that this leader was very I don't want to say toxic, but certainly there were a lot of people that felt that this leader was behaving in a way that they didn't appreciate, and was making demands of people's time and was being very directive. And so I went again with the expectation of talking to that leader and having to think about how I was going to coach them and all this other stuff. And then as soon as I started talking to them and talked about those symptoms that I was observing and the negative outcomes that the team was getting from the lack of the product owner, without me even saying anything, the manager was like, oh shit, that's my fault, isn't it? Because I keep making this person come to these meetings and he's not available. And I didn't need to say anything for the product owner, just by seeing what was going on and by having the patterns put in front of him, that leader immediately recognized what was happening. And so all of the challenges that I thought I was going to have with coaching and mentoring people, it actually turned out just to be a transparency problem. It was just that we couldn't see the impacts of the decisions that we were making. And by making them visible, that I think really, really helped people. So I don't know if that answers the question. I don't know if anyone, I feel like it's a bit quiet in here at the moment. So I don't know if anyone wants to kind of throw a live question out or a follow up to that or anything else.
Yeah, I'm actually curious too, because for I guess it's a follow-up. I'm looking at the lots of rollover test bottleneck. My immediate thought is like maybe too much work in progress. I'm curious how do you figure out like symptom, and it could have been something else, right? Like how do you?
Yeah. Yeah, and so there's a couple of things to keep in mind, and obviously we don't have the time to deep dive in the whole dysfunction mapping thing here. And so maybe later I'll talk about the workshops that I run where you can learn a bit more. But the short answer is that there is no right answer, and that's something you have to keep in mind the whole time. And something that I've seen several times now is that you can have two groups of people or two individuals looking at the same system, and they could each attribute the dysfunction, the symptoms in a different way, right? So I might see these things and say, I think this is the problem, and someone else might say, I think it's a work in progress problem. And both of those things can lead to an actual hypothesis that leads us to positive change, because that's the nature of complex systems, right? There's not necessarily one right thing to tweak. So that's what the measures are all about. It's about making sure that we can put boundaries in place so that we can take our action and then see, okay, does stuff change in the way that we wanted it to? And that kind of gives us a bit of safety to then maybe take another step and hopefully compound. But I think the thing that's interesting is that often you will get to the point where there are clearly two or three dysfunctions and they connect imperfectly to multiple systems, and you would say, well, actually this could be caused by this and this. And so in fact, for example, you can see an example of how I've managed that on this board. Again, bearing in mind that this view is very simplified compared to what maybe a real map would look like, but you can see that there's new work constantly pushed mid-sprint, and it appears twice with a little red tag says related on it, which is just to remind me that I think that could be both because the product owner doesn't attend sprint planning, or it could be because we don't set a single sprint goal, which of course sprint goals being one of the ways we might try to control WIP. So again, it's the thing I want to kind of reiterate is that this is not meant to be an approach that will give you the correct answer. This is a sense-making tool. It helps you get an idea of what you think might be going on and then form that hypothesis so you can test things. And then by going through that multiple times, the picture kind of gets a bit clearer every time, but it'll never be perfect.
Thank you.
Cool. Any follow-up questions on that or any thoughts before we move on to a different question? Cool. All right. Well, I do just love an awkward silence, if I'm honest. So I will sometimes just let it get a little bit weird before we move on, but that's fun. Cool. So let's try the next one, which says, there is a lot of criticism about SMs not being familiar with the Scrum Guide. And at the same time, SMs are criticized for referencing the Scrum Guide too much. What's your take on that? Yes, both of those things are true. Would be my view. And so I guess there's obviously a lot of nuance there that really needs to be, deserves more time that we would have here. But I think when people are talking about both of these issues, they're kind of talking about something that's quite related, which is to say there is a lot of surface level understanding of the Scrum Guide. And when you only have a surface level understanding of something, the only way that you can really try to demonstrate your knowledge or your expertise is by using the right language. So without going too far down a philosophical rabbit hole, there's a concept called purity testing, which is to say sometimes we deliberately say things or do things just to try and figure out if someone knows things that we know or believes the things that we believe. And I think there's a lot of that in the Scrum world. And I think that's where this comes from. My view is that it's a symptom. So if I were to put that on my dysfunction map, this is a symptom of our poor training and support in the industry that we give to new and even intermediate Scrum masters and Agile coaches, which is to say a lot of people, they'll get a 2-day workshop certificate and then they'll get thrown into a highly dysfunctional organization with very little ongoing training and support. And, their understanding of Scrum never really deepens beyond just the words that are written in the Scrum Guide. And of course, understanding is much deeper than that. So when this happens, I guess the problem is that people are reverting to just demonstrating that they have memorized what's written in the Scrum Guide as a replacement for demonstrating true understanding of empiricism, of complex systems, right, of real problem solving. And so that I think those two things are just deeply, deeply entwined. And that's, in fact, one of the reasons that I'm so passionate about this and what I'm doing is because I'm hoping to give a tool to people that helps you take that theoretical knowledge and then apply it in a real practical way, in a way that's experimental, empirical, and allows you to kind of test and learn as you go. So I guess to kind of sum it up, my view is that we should be thinking about what does the Scrum Guide mean, not what does the Scrum Guide say. And if we can kind of deepen that understanding, then referencing the Scrum Guide becomes less important. So I don't know if anyone has any follow-ups or any other thoughts to offer on that.
Yeah, I think so, Michael. My follow-up would be, so what advice would you give to a Scrum Master who's working with this brand new Scrum team? But should they bring up the Scrum Guide at all while they're introducing themselves and trying to work with the team, or should they just leave it out of the conversation in the entirety, and for how long? How do they know when to bring it up?
Yeah, no, so it's a good question. And I'm going to give the really annoying answer, right? Which is it depends. But the reason it depends, and hopefully this is what's going to give you a bit of clear guidance, is it depends on what the team cares about. So some teams have selected Scrum as a way of working because they believe it will help them, in which case talking about and referencing Scrum can be a useful sort of point to bring people together, right? We've said that we want to work in this way. That's what it looks like. Let's align to that to some degree. A lot of teams are doing Scrum because of a management decree, right? They've been told you must practice Scrum because that's the way that we work in this organization. Or maybe they've in the past had an overzealous Scrum master that's forced a certain way of working on them. For those people, referencing the Scrum Guide is not going to be useful. And that's where it becomes much, much more important to be able to talk about empiricism and, small batches and inspect and adapt and, all these other things that, they are in the Scrum Guide, but we can talk about without actually having to reference the Scrum Guide, if you get what I'm saying. So that's where, for me, things like the values and the principles become much more important. So obviously Scrum's 5 values are really useful. You've got the 3 pillars of empiricism that I referenced a second ago. But even just going to the common sense of some of it, right? Which is to say, yeah, of course we want to be a self-managing team, right? Of course we want to work in small batches. Of course we want to have a single clear goal to help guide us and make decisions. If you can kind of talk about it from the sense of, what we're trying to achieve and what the purpose is of those things, which, as is part of that dysfunction map, that might be a better jumping off point for people. But like I say, if the reality is we're a team that does want to do Scrum, then you're probably in a much safer place to actually just talk about Scrum and why the Scrum Guide says what it says.
Thank you.
Cool. Any other questions or follow-ups on that one before we move on?
I think, do you want to talk a little bit about how those things like directly relate back to purpose in the dysfunction map?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. So in terms of, so if you scroll back down to where the example dysfunction map is, so you can see there's that step in the middle, right? So you've got symptom and dysfunction on one side, and then it goes to purpose, and then it goes to solution and measure. And it's not super clear in this visual, but purpose is, very deliberately in the middle because it's the central theme of this approach, right, of what we're doing. And the reason that this step is something that I find very important and that I've deliberately built into my way of working is because we as Scrum Masters and coaches, and again, I very much include myself in this, I have done this many times, we make the mistake of identifying a practice, let's say setting a sprint goal, and we therefore just want to apply that or implement it and say to the team, we should set a sprint goal because the Scrum guide says so. And that tends not to be useful, right? That tends to, if nothing else, make people unsure of why we're doing things, which makes it hard for them to make decisions. But at worst, it can make them actively hostile because they don't care about these things, right? We're just trying to kind of force work on them. So purpose is the chance for us as practitioners to really take that step back and say, do I understand why this thing exists? Like, why does Scrum say that we should set a single clear sprint goal? Why is it that we can't have 2 sprint goals or 5 sprint goals, right? Why is that something that is written into the guide? And for that, you might take a day and, you might read through the Scrum guide or watch some YouTube videos or talk to other Scrum practitioners and kind of get the sense of it. And the idea is to then distill down what you're thinking into that little sticky that I call it a purpose statement, which you can think of like a user story. So it's like a placeholder for a conversation. It's not the be all and end all of what you're thinking, but it's there to kind of sum up what you have talked about and then act as a placeholder so you can kind of have that conversation with other people. And the important thing is that it represents what your team or your stakeholders care about, not what you care about as a Scrum Master, right? It's not enough to say Scrum's great and we should do Scrum. What's the value? What do we get from actually changing our way of working, right? And so here it says a single sprint goal provides focus and enables rapid decisions. And that's particularly important because in this particular example, the things that the team was worried about over in the symptoms was a lack of focus and an inability to make decisions. So we're anchoring our need for change, our desire for change, and our potential solution to the actual problems that the team cares about, not just you should do Scrum because Scrum says so.
Yeah, so it's sort of your why, like knowing your why. Why is it important to make this change?
Right. Nice. Yeah. So any other follow-ups or thoughts on any of that?
This is Amir. I have I guess I'm not exactly sure where I'm going with this, but this card resonates with me. And as I map it to, Agile, having some going through some hard times right now. There are a lot of corporations that did away with Scrum Masters. And I feel like what you're saying is, this dysfunction mapping tool, it'll help you find out what the troubles, what the issues are. And if you can be adaptive, the key word is adaptive, and see how you can help the team and adapt that way. That's how I see it. Is that a good way of putting it? Because sometimes, and there are some places that the Bible Scrum guide, if you try to follow everything to the letter, it won't work. I really like what you said, follow what the intentions are and not the words.
Right.
But it just, to me, it feels like this could be something that, Scrum Master 2.0 could be based on.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought, and it's certainly something that has helped guide me a little bit, which is to say, I'm trying to help Scrum Masters to be perceived as being more valuable so that we don't continue down this path of, the layoffs and the job changes and all that kind of stuff. I maybe overestimate my ability to influence things, but, you got to try. But yeah, so there's two big elements to this of why I think it's valuable. And one of them you just hit perfectly right, which is our ability to actually be experimental in our approach to change, so that instead of just trying to say implement Scrum exactly as it says so in the Scrum guide, we can actually start understanding those principles and then pull them in to serve a particular need, right? The team is struggling with this problem. Now I'm going to pull this technique in to help us to solve that problem. And it's a much more incremental step rather than just trying to kind of change an entire kind of way of working overnight. The second part of it that we haven't really talked much about yet, but I think for me is a really big one, is the actual evidence that this gives you after the fact, right? Because by going through this process and building your hypothesis, well, then once you've done something, you've now got a record of the patterns you saw, the action you took, what changed, and how you measured it. And you can actually then much more easily demonstrate to other people your value as a Scrum Master, as an Agile coach, because these are based on real wins, right? These are things that the team cared about that no longer are impacting them. And I think it gives you a much easier way to tell that story, because, you know, I've been in a scenario, in fact, where it was, I was working in a contractor role as a Scrum Master, and, you know, it was time for contract renewal, and I had to have that chat with my boss. And literally he came to me and said, you know, there's a couple of people in this particular team that don't think that you've been, you know, doing what you should be doing as a Scrum Master, by which he meant I wasn't running the daily Scrum. I wasn't telling them what work to do. I wasn't managing Jira, right? And so I was able to be like, cool, well, let me show you what I have been doing. And then I was able to pull out this dysfunction map and talk about all these patterns that we'd found, all these problems that we'd solved, all these things that had changed and how we measured them. And suddenly my value was unquestionable, right? And so I think that for me is a really big thing that we Scrum Masters need to get better at, because again, we often don't get a lot of good guidance on how to measure ourselves, how to show our success. And I think this is one really good way to do that. Obviously, I'm a bit biased to make that statement, though, so, you know, take it with a grain of salt. Nice. Any follow-ups or thoughts or questions on that before we move on to the next question?
Because Michael, some organizations unfortunately see a role of a Scrum Master as somebody who is asking 3 questions in a stand-up, and if you're not doing it, if you're stepping back because you want your team to become self-sufficient, they're looking like you're procrastinating, you're not doing your job.
Mm-hmm.
How do you address those kind of managers?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess it's 2 things there, right? So number one is it's by demonstrating success. And I think, so I've been through this scenario a few times myself, and it's one example that really sticks in my brain, because I started an organization as a Scrum Master, and the person who was now my boss had previously been the Scrum Master for that team. So not only was there a lot of expectation on what a Scrum Master should do, it was tied up very much in the identity of the actual person that was going to be doing my performance reviews and all that stuff, because he had been that sort of Scrum Master that ran the daily Scrums and did Jira and all that stuff. And so challenging that was quite dangerous. And I'm going to be honest, the first 3 months, that guy absolutely hated me, and he questioned everything that I did because it was very different to what he did. And I was insistent about things. But by going through this iterative approach of here's a small win and here's a measurable improvement, and gaining a bit of extra trust, and then moving on to the next thing, that for me is what builds it up. And so eventually, because I was there as a contractor as well, that boss that had hated me at the beginning actually created a new role as an Agile practice lead to keep me on board when my contract expired. So that shows like how that process can go, right, if you constantly demonstrate that value. But I think the second part that's worth just keeping in mind is sometimes the dysfunction, right, the problem in that scenario is that people don't understand how the choices that they make affect the teams and the people around them. And that's one of the great things that you can do with dysfunction mapping, right, is it's just a way to make it transparent. Because a trick that I like to use is when I gather up my symptoms, I'll put things in quotation marks to represent that someone has said something to me, and I'll keep it anonymous, so it's not, you know, who said it, but it allows you to put a bunch of stuff on the wall that's objective, right? It's not I'm making a judgment about whether this is true or false. It's this was being said. And if you can see 10 examples of people saying, I think that the daily Scrum is useless and we don't get any value from it, that's quite hard for someone to rationalize away. And so putting that in front of them makes them realize, oh, hey, actually, yeah, we do need to change something here. And so I think that's the 2 big elements for me. It's that incrementalism and then the transparency.
Thank you.
Cool. Follow-ups, thoughts? Cool. So should we jump on to the next one, which says, can this work at any level of the organization? So yeah, basically this is one of those areas where I do struggle to figure out what the correct amount of detail is to give people when I teach them this approach, because I don't want to kind of overwhelm. I try to keep it simple enough that you can tweak it for your context. But one of the things that I will often do on my own dysfunction maps is have essentially a dotted line halfway down so I can separate sort of team or team of teams level problems from management organizational culture level problems. But it is a systems thinking approach, right? So the idea here is while we can't understand the whole system, we should consider all of the information we have available when we're making our decisions. And so bounding yourself just to a team level is definitely going to give you a big blind spot. So I find that, yeah, thinking about, what's happening at that organizational level, what are the big problems and how might they filter through and connect to some of these smaller things that we're seeing. Again, there's no right way to capture this stuff. But what I usually find is that I want to kind of be working on a couple of things at a time. So I'll be working on, a few team level problems and then a few big, hairy organizational level problems, right? And so to give an example from one organization, in the same sprint where I'm trying to help my single team get better at setting a single sprint goal, I'm also having coffee meetings with the CEO to try and explain to them why timesheets are awful and should be gotten rid of. So those are got two problems at very different ends of the spectrum. But the reason I'm dealing with both of them is because they're related to the issue of a lack of focus, and we're doing too many things at once. And so having that view helps me to kind of attack that problem from multiple directions. Any thoughts, follow-ups on any of that?
I think it's nice how you describe it. It really gives like a system thinking tool and like really map it out. So I think that was a great example for me.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate it. And yeah, it's the joke that I sometimes make is that what I'm really trying to do with dysfunction mapping is to just trick people into systems thinking. But the reason I say that is because systems thinking is actually really, really hard, it turns out, right? And we often don't actually get taught how to do that in a systematic way. So I know I'm maybe confusing two similar words there, right? So to be systematically systems thinking is difficult. So this is about reflexing that muscle, right? And it is actually my hope that after a while, the sort of formal structure of dysfunction mapping becomes much less important. What matters is that you're in that mindset of looking for patterns and then experimenting. And if you do that, then hopefully you'll get somewhere good.
I'd be curious what would be an example of organizational purpose in that yellow. Because one, the teams, like it feels like I could look at like team level, but organization, what might be an example of a purpose?
Yeah, it's a good question, because again, the workshop that I run, just for the sake of making it easier to teach, we do tend to focus really in on Scrum and team level stuff, just because everyone kind of agree on what these things mean. Whereas when you're at that kind of organizational level, it's much more open to interpretation, right? And so the way that I kind of think about it and describe it is that purpose at that bigger level is much more tied to the organizational culture that you're trying to cultivate. So that's often where your organizational values are going to come in, right? Most companies have their own stated values that they share. And so those are often going to be our purposes, where we kind of tie back to, well, this is something that we've said that we care about as an organization. And then our dysfunctions in that context, they're not necessarily going to be places where, say, we're breaking the rules of Scrum, because that doesn't really apply, but places where we're not living those values. What does that look like? What are the ways that we might expect to see that play out? And the symptoms, of course, would be the actual negative outcomes that creates. And so again, this is where that structure it's very agnostic, right? It doesn't have to be used in an agile context. It's not tied to Scrum. That's just where I've kind of built it from as it's my background. But really the thing that we're trying to get to here is, what are the values and principles that we care about? What are the things that we do that deviate from those values and principles, and how can we actually observe that? How do we know that those things are causing us pain, so that we're actually solving the problems that matter, right? Not just jumping on anything. And then if you can do that, that's what gets you in that reinforcing loop, right?
Love it. Thanks.
Cool. Any other thoughts or follow-ups? Cool. So we've got little bit of time left, so we'll jump into what is the trigger to create a dysfunction map. So this is a really interesting one because this is hard for me to say, right? Because the context in which I've been using it for so long has been such an incremental journey that you're going to be starting from a different point. So I can let you know that I started doing this as just a pen and paper activity as I was kind of learning and sensing patterns. And over time, it became more and more structured. But what I know is that anytime I start with a new team or a new organization, the first thing I do is start observing and interviewing people and, one-on-ones, coffee chats, trying to get a sense of, where is your pain coming from? What can I do to help? And as soon as I start doing that, that's the beginnings of a dysfunction map, right? I start connecting and theming and forming those things together. Now, if you, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, if I can add some context to this based on you joining us, Michael. So the previous organization that I worked for, Michael came and did a workshop with just our Scrum Masters, or just a subset of our Scrum Masters, and we had something already built. We called our obstacle backlog, and this is where we, across Scrum teams, we're seeing things that are obstacles to the way in which the team works, obstacles that are keeping them from working effectively, that are keeping them from working efficiently, and then we were kind of already coming up with ways that we could maybe solve for those obstacles. But then once we learned about dysfunction map, and we realized that like many of these are symptoms of a greater dysfunction, so that essentially that obstacle backlog that we were working on became our funnel into dysfunction mapping. And so we invited Michael in, and he did a workshop just with our material, and we kind of started to work on that dysfunction map. And while we created a very brief, version of it, then after that we iterated on it, and we kept going. And then when we got to the experiments that we want to try to resolve the dysfunction that we were seeing, then we had a Jira board for Scrum Masters, and then we would start putting those on the board and start trying some of those experiments with our teams, seeing how it goes, seeing if it truly gets rid of that symptom, but the deeper level dysfunction really is what we were trying to solve for. And we had some great success laying it out that way in a dysfunction map. It really helped us, especially the purpose column. Like, why do we care? Why is this important? And so that's one way we used it. And that was one trigger for us, as we were getting all of these different obstacles that we were seeing across teams. Like for example, they don't have a singular sprint goal. That was a big one across multiple teams. Sprint goal. So that there's one example, but there are many examples like that we found were happening systemically across multiple teams. And so that's the group who's working on the dysfunction map. We didn't actually take the dysfunction map to our teams and do it with the team level. We did it at the Scrum Master level. I don't know if that helps answer your question.
Just to add to that then, because I guess this is sort of why I said at the beginning that there's nothing magic and new about dysfunction mapping, right? It's just a collection of things that I've learned that kind of structures a bunch of different ideas. And to Jamie's point, it's like you've probably already got some stuff written down. You've probably already got some ideas. And so that naturally can be pulled into a dysfunction map. And then the only question there then is like, who do you want to collaborate to kind of build this out? Because, as Jamie said, you might just work with a couple of other Scrum Masters and kind of get a sense of what's going on. You might collaborate directly with your team on this if you think that's a psychologically safe environment to do so. There's no right or wrong answer to any of that. It's just a tool that is meant to give you a bit more of a sense of confidence in running those little experiments. And so, sometimes those experiments won't work out the way you wanted, but then you'll learn something and your next one's going to be a lot easier to form. So.
Yeah, cool. And there were plenty of aha moments where we were like, it kind of made the invisible visible for us to even map it to that greater dysfunction. Because we were doing firefighting mode. We were just trying to put out the fires of the symptoms, but they really led to a bigger dysfunction. If we resolve for that, then we solve for all those symptoms as well. So it was just making the invisible visible for us as well.
Cool. So on that note, what I might do, because I can see the next question says, is this template available for anyone to use? So what I'm going to do is quickly chuck a Mirrorverse link into the chat, because I'll do you one better. As well as the dysfunction map template itself, there's a whole workshop template that has activities for each section, as well as decks of cards that you can use to gamify the whole process. And so this includes the funnel building deck, which gives you ideas of the sorts of questions you might want to ask as you kind of look for answers. The Scrum dysfunction deck, which gives you 88 examples of ways that you might break the rules of Scrum. Again, not that you should implement all those things, but they give you good, conversation starters. There's the Scrum solution deck, which includes cards based on things like the 6 stances of Scrum Master and the pillars of empiricism that allow you to rapidly form experiments about how you might solve a problem. And then finally, the measures deck, which gives you a bunch of examples of ways that you might come up with measures against your symptoms and the problems you're trying to solve. And so that whole workshop is available free of charge. You can run that with your teams. You can, play with it by yourself. But then if you want to get into even more detail, we do regularly run full day workshops. So it's either a full 8-hour workshop or 2 half days, 4 hours each. And there's actually one of those coming up just next week that's going to be being run through Scrum Masters of the Universe. And both Jamie and I will be co-facilitating that. And so I'm sure that the link to that will go in the chat. And so at some point you can grab a ticket if you want to come, because Jamie's actually doing a 50% off on the ticket price, so it's insanely cheap at the moment, and that actually ends.
It ends today, though. It ends at midnight Central Daylight Time. So if you want to get in on half off, and take a deeper dive, I highly recommend it, because there's a lot to it, and you can really go step by step and really understand it before you try to use it. So I would really encourage it. And there'll be more coming in the future as well. There'll be more dates, but I will put a link in the chat.
Yeah, cool. So yeah, it would obviously be awesome to see any of you all there, but otherwise, I guess I think we're getting close to the end of the time box, right? It is 7 that we're cutting off. Is that right, Jamie? Or is it 7:15?
Yeah.
7.
We have a hard stop right at the top of the hour.
Cool.
So probably have time for one more quick question or comment here.
Yeah, I was gonna say, rather than going to, so I will try to respond to the stuff that we didn't get to on the Miro board. So keep an eye out on LinkedIn. It's probably the best place to follow for anything that we didn't get to. And then otherwise, maybe we'll use this last 5 minutes to just see if there's any final kind of thoughts or questions from anyone that we didn't get.
Yeah, I've just posted that link in chat, in case any of you would like to join us. And Bob Galen, I'm very excited about that. Can you tell?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Hi, Michael. It's actually my first time getting this sort of knowledge about dysfunction mapping. So what do you suggest for a newbie as a starting point? This free Miro board that you just posted, or any other resource?
Yes, there's a few other things. So to be honest, the Miro board is probably going to be a bit overwhelming if you're brand new. So what I would suggest is if you go to dysfunctionmapping.com, there is a learning materials page that's got a few links, but you can also just Google dysfunction mapping. And for example, I've got a Medium article that kind of gives you a very basic rundown. There's a YouTube video, about a 3-minute long one, that gives like a brief introduction. And then I've actually done a previous talk at Scrum Masters of the Universe that was an hour long that dived into a bit more detail. So you can see that there, as well as I've got like conference talks that are up and recorded and that kind of thing. So there's loads of stuff out there depending on how you like to learn, whether you're a reader or a watcher. But the other thing that I always kind of sort of try to say to everyone is, I want to help people to be successful with this stuff, right? So if you connect with me on LinkedIn, if you've got any questions, if you want to just have a one-on-one Zoom call and just chat something through, I will always try to make time for that. And then, yeah, if there's any particular kind of content that you would find useful that isn't currently available, please let me know, because I need to think about that, and I'm probably missing some tricks there.
No, that's a great.
And taking the class. That's for me, that helped really gel things and seal things. I'm not just trying to push the class, obviously.
No,
but it really does help cement this in your head, and you'll have a much better dysfunction map, I believe, if you.
Yeah. Oh yeah, the class is the best way, right? Because it's 8 hours with a bunch of other people, liberating structures, lots of activities, games. The class is, I think, a good class. Obviously, again, bias, but it's definitely going to be the best option. But yeah, check out some of that other stuff first, see if that piques your interest, and then obviously reach out to myself or Jamie if the class seems interesting.
Yep.